piece has not been collected in a book, at least not yet. It was published in the Threepenny Review a couple of years ago. It is called Cities, Bulls, and the Boy at 17. All right. Washington, D.C. residents of a certain age will remember the late Davy Marlin Jones. For the evening news broadcast on Channel 9, the local CBS affiliate, Marlin Jones gave movie reviews, but calling him a film critic is sort of like calling Macbeth a story about a married couple. There's a little more to it than that. Marlin Jones wore wide-brimmed fedoras and three-piece suits, and he looked as if he were wearing one of those plastic eyeglasses, big-nose, handlebar mustache combos that used to be a staple of kids' birthday parties. But on him, the parts were all real. Delivering reviews in an unaffectedly comical voice, he referred to note cards, one for each movie under discussion. At the end of a review, if he liked the movie, he would place the card in the inside pocket of his jacket. If he didn't, he would toss it, the cue for the studio sound effects man to make it land with a crash. If Marlin Jones found a movie to be well worth seeing but flawed, he would tear off a corner of the card, representing his reservations, and put the rest in his pocket. Whereas if a movie was abysmal, except, say, for one good performance, he would pocket the corner and toss the rest. This showmanship, this eccentricity, was not meant to hide a lack of critical powers. Marlin Jones gave thoughtful, sharp reviews, criticism so good I still remember parts of it after 3 decades. He called Return to Oz, quote, a movie for people who hate children and aren't too fond of themselves, unquote. He once said that Kim Basinger was, quote, not a bad actress, she is a non-actress. And his concluding statement about a movie in which she starred was, 9.5 weeks, it only seems that long. Davy Marlin Jones, as those reviews will suggest, was not one people suspected of being on movie studios' payroll. A good review from him meant something. And so one broadcast in 1980 got my full attention. At the end of the review, this jaded, acerbic critic held his note card in both hands, leaned forward, looked straight into the camera, and said in complete earnest, "This is a brilliant, brilliant film." The film was Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull. I was 17 that year. They've stopped making 17-year-olds of the kind I was. They had mostly stopped making them then, and that is in no way a boast. Today's 17-year-olds seem to have lived complete lives already, with resumes barely contained on one page, with not only lovers but ex-lovers. My resume when I was 17 would have fit inside a fortune cookie, and as for lovers, there's nothing to discuss. I did have a life, one that took place largely inside my head. I planned to conquer the world through the comics I had been drawing for nearly a decade, not realizing that this ambition was already crumbling. There were girls I liked, and I even called them on the phone, talking to them sometimes for hours about everything except what I wanted to say, circling like a shark around a small island, no more able to come to the point than the shark was able to grow legs and walk up to its prey. There was one exception to all this living in my head, a girl who was a year behind me in high school. She was, I write this to my shame, too heavy to fit my idea of a girlfriend, but she was not unattractive. She was not exactly shy either, and she made it clear that she wanted me for a boyfriend. It was equally clear that things weren't quite right with her, though not, this is especially plain in retrospect, the thing she claimed. She sometimes got searing, blinding, and completely imaginary headaches because of her brain tumor. When these headaches came on, it helped a lot to ease the pain, she suggested, if I kissed her. Did I believe all this? No, at least not completely. And yet I went along with it, kissing and all, in part for reasons I can't explain, in part for reasons that probably need no explanation. The first time this happened, we were in the theater to see the movie that David Marlin Jones had sold me on, Raging Bull. I ended up missing parts of the movie and not concentrating fully on what I did see. When it was over, I apologized to this girl, saying that I shouldn't have kissed her because as much as I liked her, I didn't feel that way. She got good and mad. I wasn't done discovering what a singularly bad date movie Raging Bull is, but I'm getting ahead of my story. This was the fall of 1980, when the days were getting shorter, when the wind in D.C. began to carry a chill and shook brown leaves from trees, when I stood like a skier looking down the length of my senior year of high school, not sure what lay at the bottom. College? Yes, but where? I would leave my mother, my grandmother, my older sisters, and our working class to working poor black neighborhood to do what? I had the sense of a big world out there for me to discover, which both excited and scared me. I was, if not quite consciously, attuned to things I didn't understand, a category that includes a great deal even now, and that in 1980 comprised just about everything. I had read a few books, but only a few. I had always loved movies, finding some funny, A Day at the Races, Uptown Saturday Night, some exciting, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, Rocky, some stirring, partly because of their soundtracks, Motown and Cooley High, Simon and Garfunkel songs, and The Graduate. But what did it mean when a film was brilliant? What language was that? That question had driven me to the theater for Raging Bull, and though I was distracted while watching it, I thought I had a faint glimmer of understanding. Raging Bull, like Rocky, is about a boxer, but the resemblance ends there, and not just because the former were shot in black and white, the latter in color. Rocky is about believing in yourself enough to pursue a dream, one that goes beyond what you've ever felt capable of. As thrilling as the boxing scenes are, boxing is nearly incidental to the story, which could almost be about running or auto racing. And while winning is supposedly beside the point in Rocky, the title character loses very narrowly in the end. It really isn't, because the excitement in the film is the direct result of how very close Rocky comes to victory. By contrast, for the real-life Jake LaMotta, as portrayed by Robert De Niro in Raging Bull, boxing is not a vehicle, but a natural extension of this man's blind, deep-seated aggression. His many wins have the feel of defeat, since he seems to demonstrate through them the sum total of what he can do as a human being. Many times over the course of the film, he raises his arms in victory, but he seems no prouder at those moments than at the end of the savage, nearly unwatchable beating he takes at the hands of his nemesis, Sugar Ray Robinson, whom he taunts with, "You never got me down, Ray." Raging Bull made Rocky look like what it is, a very good cartoon, and suggested that brilliance might lie in showing a subject not as we want it to be, but as it actually is. I think, anyway, that I took this in at 17, in that period of my mind's groping. I was, speaking of cartoons, coming toward the end of my drawing, finding it inadequate, or finding my ability to do it inadequate for what I wanted to express. Not that I knew exactly what that was, or what a better mode might be. Full of feeling, clueless about what to do with it, I sometimes went for aimless walks, alone, in other parts of D.C., going past bookstores and coffee shops near DuPont Circle, passing the townhouses and spindly trees along P Street en route to Georgetown. I found that I liked doing this on Sunday, when the city's weekend craziness, which I had missed sitting at home, had spent itself, and the mellower side of city life was on display. Elegantly dressed people eating at outdoor cafes, or men in moth-eaten Just So jackets glimpsed through windows as they read books and nursed cups of coffee. This love of a city seen through a beautifying lens had a counterpart in another black and white movie I saw in a second-run theater around the same time, Woody Allen's Manhattan. I'd like to be able to write here that I saw those opening shots of Manhattan at 17 and was so struck by their beauty that my love and appreciation for great cinema was born on the spot. The truth is that my eye for purely visual beauty in film and painting took a while to develop, is, I hope, still developing. I saw Manhattan again recently. I took in that first sequence with Woody Allen's comic wistful voiceover, with the swelling woodwinds and brass of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, with, most of all, those black and white shots of the city. And my 50-year-old jaw, I swear to you, fell. But in 1980, as the cinematography and references to Dovzhenko's Earth and Cezanne's Apples went flap, flap over my head, I responded to the film's humor and to the ambiguity of its ending. You have to have a little faith in people, says Tracy, played by Mariel Hemingway, the film's youngest and most emotionally intelligent character. This, the last line of the movie, left part of me thinking, wait, you can't stop there, and another quieter part sensing that I'd stumbled onto a kind of storytelling I hadn't known about. I'm not sure if or how many times I saw Manhattan between my first viewing and the most recent one. Once, maybe? I've seen Raging Bull several times over the years, though. I remember one viewing particularly well. It took place in the theater in 1989, nearly a decade after I'd first seen the movie with my high school friend. This time, too, I went with a young woman, and this time, too, I was distracted from what was happening on the screen, but for very different reasons, and in a way that actually revealed something to me about Raging Bull, namely what an unrelentingly harsh film it is. During the scene when Joey is slamming the head of Salvi with a taxi door, I looked over at my date, who was sunk down in her seat, her face covered with tears. It seems she forgave me for putting her through that. We have since married and raised 2 children together. I saw Raging Bull again recently. It sounds like a joke to say that Raging Bull and Manhattan take on the same themes, since the latter focuses on the relationship entanglements of a nervous intellectual, the former on the life and career of a brute. But I contend that they do. In addition to their New York setting and gorgeous black and white cinematography, the 2 films have in common the theme of humans' inevitable tendency to hurt one another, intentionally or not. The insecure, neurotic Mary, Diane Keaton, the figure at the center of Manhattan's five-person romantic pileup, is not the film's emotional center. That role belongs to the 17-year-old Tracy, who is, perhaps because of her youth, the purest figure in the story. And it is this sweet young person whom the Allen character, for all his moral pronouncements, for all his reluctance to do so, ends up wounding. Jake LaMotta of Raging Bull, of course, beats up men for a living, nothing personal. But what he can't beat is his own jealousy. Thanks to De Niro's performance, you can all but see the workings of Jake's small brain, see him connecting all the wrong dots until the resulting violence drives away the only people he cares about. Given that each of us is ultimately out for himself, the center of his own world, given that we will hurt others, whether we are the conscientious intellectual or the insanely jealous professional fighter, why even try to do right, to treat others well? Together, the 2 films suggest an answer. Other people, for all their capacity to hurt, and despite evidence to the contrary, are generally worth it. Witness Jake LaMotta, alone in the world, his career over, trying, however pathetically, to resurrect himself as a performer of the works of Shakespeare and Paddy Chayefsky, trying to become a human being. You have to have a little faith in people. In the spring of 1986, I had an office job in Georgetown. By then, I had been to college in Ohio and back. I had been hurt, and I had inflicted some hurt, too, none of it on purpose. And there was more to come. I was about to move to take another office job, this one in Manhattan. I was still in Georgetown, though, walking around at lunch one day, when, along with several other people on the sidewalk, I saw a familiar face. Actually, the face was less familiar than the things on and around it. The fedora, the glasses, the handlebar mustache, all of it just like on TV. Seeing my eyes on him, Davy Marlon Jones smiled at me and said in that same comical voice, "How goes your world?" Not stopping to hear the answer, continuing his journey in a world of his own. That's that. Thank you. All right, I think I will read a short piece from my essay collection, Love for Sale. And then I will follow up with, or end with a section of the memoir. So this piece from Love for Sale is called On Masks. On Masks. I'm a black American. For that reason, I take pride, you can argue over whether I should or not, in the fact that Picasso found inspiration for his work in the African tribal masks he saw at a Paris museum in 1907. Picasso was taken with the mask's simplicity of form and, because he was a superstitious man, with their being intended to ward off evil. But while Picasso was inspired by the masks, and while the faces he painted could themselves be said to look like masks, his work performed the opposite function, not hiding but showing the person, revealing the subject not as a fixed entity, but as its true, ever-changing, impermanent self. With the African masks on one hand and Picasso's paintings on the other, we have a dichotomy, masking versus unmasking. Or do we? We think of masks as closing off identity, but often they serve or are intended to expand it. They can open doors for the self, give the wearer new ability. Some of the traditional masks made in Liberia and the Ivory Coast were meant to evoke a spirit called ganyege. They were worn by foot racers to help them in competitions. In Central Africa, masks were worn in rituals tied to boys' emergence into manhood. In Western culture, the most prominent setting for masks may be the pages of superhero comic books, in which the costume characters use masks for much the same purpose as young Central African males, making the transition from relative weakness, boyhood, to strength, manhood. The retiring Bruce Wayne becomes the fearsome Batman. The milquetoast Clark Kent becomes the nearly invulnerable Superman. Kent does not put on a literal mask, of course. His inexplicably successful disguise is a face without glasses. For those who don't read comic books or believe in the power of a mask to speed a runner along, there are, quote, real examples. Here the masks tend to be figurative. In his 1895 poem, We Wear the Mask, the Black American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar writes, "We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. We smile, but oh great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise." The we refers to oppressed blacks a generation after the end of slavery, and the mask might not seem to be particularly empowering until we consider that the grins and lies and human guile allowed blacks to survive in the world until the great unmasking that was the civil rights movement. Really, though, what Martin Luther King and others offered was more of a trading of masks. A person who submits without violence, as fire hoses, police dogs, and clubs are used on him, is wearing a mask of sorts, one that helps him win his freedom. I wear masks, one at least. This next part is actually a little bit out of date. For over a decade, I have run a department in a privately owned company, a capacity in which I have supervised numerous workers not long out of college, and thus unused to office life. A little over a year ago, as I lectured two young workers on the importance of punctuality, the serious looks on their faces made me laugh inside, since the lecture, as they had no way of knowing, came from a man who sees himself more or less as a 5-year-old he was in the late 1960s. My self-perception notwithstanding, the boss mask lets me run the department with some degree of effectiveness. It allows me to be a manager, which I have not always been. My identity is expanded. Which in turn raises some questions. Whoever I consider the real me to be, for half of my waking hours I am an office worker. During that time, the mask is the self. My wife and children see more or less what I consider to be the real me, but individually they see slightly differing versions, and the three of them together are outnumbered by the dozens of people I've worked with over the years, people who saw a different man or men when they looked at me. So who am I in the world? A picture of the totality might look like one of Picasso's works, with each perspective as valid as all the others, fighting for domination. To return for a moment to the superheroes, in the second Spider-Man movie, the hero lies unconscious in a subway car, surrounded by people he has just saved. They peek under his mask, and one of them says, "He's just a kid." But in the world of the movie, he's not just a kid, he's also Spider-Man, which is the only reason everyone is standing around talking about him. No visual art, not comics, not even the work of Picasso, can capture the self in the fullness of its complexity and contradiction, with masks on and off. But how glorious the attempt can be. I have a fantasy of a portrait, abstract or at most semi-representational, painted on a very large canvas. The artist would aspire at once to the fluidity of Jackson Pollock, the colorful boldness of Wassily Kandinsky or Maurice Duflaminck, and the somber blacks and whites of Willem de Kooning. This artist would depict a grown man, confidently charming a large crowd, while he is also a 6-year-old boy too shy to answer his teacher. Show him yelling at the top of his lungs, not although, but because he knows he is guilty and wrong. Show him getting wet, but refusing to put up his umbrella, because if you were going to do that, he should have done it already, it being silly to get wet and then put up an umbrella you held the whole time. Show him reading to his children in an animated voice while mentally calculating what's about to come out of his checking account. Show him, in short, doing the impossible, crazy human dance that each of us does every moment of every day. Thank you. All right, how am I doing? All right, this ought to work. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a section from Twin of Blackness, a memoir. And one of the themes of this book, I think, is fitting in or not fitting in. A lot of some of the book concerns the fact that I was born and raised in an all-black community in Washington, D.C. Later on, my interests took me to places that were predominantly white, and so I felt that there were things separating me from the community I came from, and yet the fact that I had come from the community kind of separated me from the communities I'd gone to. And you can say, well, you know, so what? We're all Americans. And yet, it took me a while to realize that, at least when I was growing up, and probably today, I got subtle messages in 100 different ways that kind of told me, sort of unconsciously, that to be American was to be white. And so this led to a great deal of confusion, which sort of came to a head in the passage I'm about to read. So, all right. This chapter is called Jazz, Fatherhood, and Albert Murray. I turned 30 in the late winter of 1993. On the very same day, sitting at my desk in the current biography offices, I got a call from Amy, my wife, who had just been a gynecologist. When we hung up, I shivered briefly. I was scared and I was happy. And I was in for a confusing time because there is nothing like approaching a milestone, fatherhood, say, for bringing up unfinished personal business. Several weeks after that day, Amy and I went to the Manhattan apartment of one of her co-workers for a Passover Seder. The other guests included more co-workers and a woman I'll call Barbara, who was then a good friend of Amy's. My wife and I were the only non-Jews present. I was the only black guest, a scenario I was certainly used to by that point. I enjoyed the meal and I participated in the readings, which I found interesting. It was when the eating and ceremony were over and the after-dinner chit-chat began that the trouble started. Barbara and one of the co-workers, I'll call her Moira because I hate that name, began talking about the experiences they had in common because of their heritage. They even sang verses of a Jewish camp song that they both remembered, a song of tradition and celebration. As the reminiscing went on, and I continued to sit quietly through it, a sadness began to overtake me, not so much because I was excluded from this conversation as because I couldn't imagine a similar one in which I would be an active participant. My black friends and I could, and sometimes did, take nostalgic jaunts in which we laughed over black fads, films, and hair care products from the 1970s. But what was the black American equivalent of a Jewish camp song? Where, in other words, were the fondly remembered pieces of a black tradition that didn't make us laugh? What constituted our celebration of ourselves, our Seder? At some point during the discussion of Jewish camp songs, Moira said to Barbara, "It's cool that you and I just met, but we have this in common." Was there really no positive tradition that all or most blacks had in common? There was, of course, Kwanzaa, an annual, not exactly widespread African-American celebration developed relatively recently, too recently for me to have embraced it as a tradition. There were also the trappings of the black church, the all-day Sunday services and screaming, sweating Protestant ministers, but those were, at least ostensibly, more about Christianity than blackness. And more importantly, as a lapsed member of the state Catholic Church, I couldn't claim those things as part of my story either. I was brooding over all this, my mood already darkening, when Moira turned to Amy and me and said, "You guys aren't holding up your end of the conversation." Barbara said to Moira, "Ask him about Hill Street Blues." This was a TV police drama Barbara and I both liked. The sad thing was her sincerity. Far from being facetious, she was trying to help, which is why I wanted to hit her. Hill Street Blues? This was the source of my cultural identity? The base from which I related to other people? I felt insulted, and instead of opening up, I retreated further into my silent gloom. When, after what seemed a week, our evening together came to a close, Moira shot a mean grin in my direction and said, joking but not really, "Have something to say next time." I am, as we know, a gentle man. I left the Seder capable of second-degree murder. The Seder had not only made me realize that there were no traditions I held sacred, it made me see that I knew of no sufficient basis for such traditions. Yes, they were the stories in my third-grade Afro-American history book, the stories of Benjamin Banneker, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, George Washington Carver, Charles Drew, Martin Luther King, and others. I knew about the bravery of black soldiers in every American war since the Revolution, about the daring of the black cowboys, about the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. I was proud of those things, but they felt like fragments, not the solid ground on which a tradition rested, but that same ground after an earthquake, broken into pieces by a calamity of slavery, poverty, prejudice, and plain old bad luck. What I needed, and didn't seem to have, was something that would unite those pieces and even reconcile them with all the misery, something that would connect the dots of my heritage and show me the picture as a Seder did for Jews. And the thing was, I couldn't draw the picture myself. It had to be there already. It had to be good and old. I could not create it because I needed to have come from it. This was the problem I'd had in relating to other black people. If my connection to them could be threatened by things as trivial as the way I talked or the skin color of the person I was dating, it was because the connection was rooted in nothing, at least nothing I knew of, deeper than pigmentation. And that, in turn, was the source of my unease over being surrounded by so many white people. Unlike me, they had never had to question their identities. They were Americans. Some were also Jews. What was I? I knew that Afrocentric blacks felt themselves to be Africans living on American soil. I applauded their confidence and wished them well, but I did not feel myself to be one of them. I thought it regrettable, to say the least, that my link to the motherland had been severed, but in my view, the damage had been done and was irreparable. I had never been to Africa. I spoke no African languages. I didn't know which of the many African tribes my ancestors had come from, and I felt incapable of embracing an emotional and intellectual connection that did not exist. Intellectual. What made all of this more than a head game was that I was about to bring a child, a biracial human being, into the world, and this kid's guide through the thicket of racial ethnic identity would be me. A man still lost after 3 decades was going to show somebody else the way. God help this kid and God help me. What was I doing? What had I done? I was on the lookout more intensely than I'd ever been for an idea to help orient me. For that reason, I recall something I had read recently, an essay in Stanley Crouch's first collection, Notes of a Hanging Judge. Crouch's take on the singer Michael Jackson's mutilation of his facial features was that it echoed African customs, while at the same time exemplifying American self-reinvention. A black man was seen as embodying Americanness. I was intrigued. Another essay in the book mentioned a black cultural critic I had never heard of, one Albert Murray. After a long search conducted in those days before Amazon.com, while Amy's belly grew bigger, I tracked down a copy of Murray's first book, The Omni-Americans. Thus did I add the 7th and final face to my own personal Mount Rushmore. The Omni-Americans helped me do 2 things: find a definition of blackness that did not exclude me, and see how that very blackness not only didn't exclude me from Americanness, but actually made me American. At the heart of the American experiment was the notion of making a way where none had existed, a shining testament to that idea being the U.S. Constitution. That determination to survive by making a new way, to improvise, had parallels in black history. For example, the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights Movement, which were American in both geography and spirit. Murray's work also helped me to understand how the racial distinctions we all obsess over are largely false in a land where blacks had both shaped and been shaped by a culture Murray called incontestably mulatto. I realized I had seen examples of this my whole life. When the father and oldest son on the Brady Bunch can slap 5, when the boys I grew up with could turn their jacket collars up in imitation of Fonzie on Happy Days, when U.S. blacks have ancestors from the same continent as descendants of Southern Italians, when blacks and whites alike have Native Americans in their bloodlines, when there are whites and blacks who can trace their lineage back to Thomas Jefferson, when the first jazz was played on instruments left over from Confederate Army bands, when there are growing numbers of biracial individuals, when all of these things are true, then not only do Americans, as Murray pointed out, look like no one so much as each other, to a great extent, they are one another. The ability to improvise was at the core of one of black people's major contributions to the culture of the United States and beyond, an art form that I myself, would you believe it, had already begun to embrace. Yes, jazz. Jazz. It was both the product of and metaphor for the Black American story. It was my old Afro-American history book set to music. Just as importantly, maybe more so, I loved the sound. I had started with Charlie Parker, Vince Guaraldi, Sonny Rollins, and Thelonious Monk, and I had picked up 2 landmark albums, Miles Davis's Kind of Blue and John Coltrane's Giant Steps. Now I began reaching for jazz records as if for life rafts, which in a sense they were. I checked out the marvelous sax work of Ben Webster, Cannonball Adderley, Stanley Turrentine, Jackie McLean, Dexter Gordon, Lucky Thompson, Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter, and the great rivals, the Romulus and Remus of the tenor sax, Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young. I felt excited by listening to the drumming of Art Blakey, Max Roach, Buddy Rich, Philly Joe Jones, and Tony Williams. Listened raptly to the rocketing trumpet solos of Freddie Hubbard, Booker Little, Charlie Shavers, Howard McGee, Roy Eldridge, and Dizzy Gillespie. got carried to other planes by the piano work of Kenny Barron, Jackie Byard, and Bill Evans. I began keeping track of which sidemen had played with which band leaders, Johnny Hodges with Ellington, Charlie Rouse with Monk, Johnny Dodds with Armstrong, and began to distinguish among the sounds of different saxmen, trumpeters, drummers, and pianists as among different human voices. There was the sweetness of Cannonball, the earthiness of Webster, the ethereality of Young. I began to search out great but less remembered players, Wardell Gray, Ike Quebec, Teddy Charles, and more. Skipping ahead. What about that child we were about to bring into the world? She arrived on a Friday night in Manhattan, 7 pounds and 5 ounces, and in my first sighting of her, a deep shade of purple. Her name lent itself to a number of nicknames, one of which was the Pie. I remember taking the Pie to a pediatrician for her first post-hospital checkup. At one point, the doctor was out of the room, and Amy and I stood over the Pie, who was lying naked on a table, gazing up at us. "Don't you love her?" I said. And I thought how, when she was old enough, I would have a story to tell this little girl.